Okay, so first of all, uh, thank you for doing this. This is a great honor for us that you.
Pleased to be with you.
Even when we are having a family conversation, we need to deal with problematic communication. Often it gets very emotional. Our parents and families have trust issues and traumas related to the Palestinian people. They carry memories of severe terrorist attacks and violence. When asked who is to blame, they blame terrorist organization and incitement in the Arab world. We have family members who voted for extreme right-wing parties that promise to restore deterrence, which has become a very popular term in Israeli media. When the emotional tendency is always towards our soldiers, our children, it's hard to contain the suffering of the other side. How would you, Professor, address those people?
Well, I'm quite familiar with them. The way to address them is to try to encourage them to look at the actual history, which is not obscure. The so-called, first of all, the word uh, terrorist, as you probably know, is a very recent innovation into Israel. What used to be called Mistananim are now called Mechablim, but no change. When I lived in Israel in the early 50s, some people in the kibbutz where I was simply refused to go on to take arms when they went to guard duty because the Mistananim were just Palestinians who'd been evicted by violence coming back to tend their fields. They didn't think they had not yet become terrorists. As the Israeli occupation became harsher and more brutal, especially after 1967, it naturally elicited resistance. And the occupiers, who are there illegally, of course, uh, naturally feel that the resistance is terrorism. Think of some unpleasant analogies, if you like. So uh, the slogan of the Gestapo was terror against terror. They were going to use terror against the terror of the partisans. And the partisans did resort to terror. In the areas that the Nazis occupied, there was what the Nazis regarded as terrorist resistance. That's very common. You can find many other examples. The Russians now talk about Ukrainian terrorism in the regions that they occupied. It's very natural, understandable. It's our boys fighting out there on the front line, destroying Palestinian villages, beating people, killing them, protecting. Take this morning, Eviatar. You saw the description. Okay, I don't have to describe it. The Palestinians who were throwing stones at the thousands of illegal settlers who were going to an illegal settlement under protection of the IDF. They're terrorists. So the IDF shoots tear gas, rubber bullets, injures them to protect the innocent people who are simply going to the illegal colony of Eviatar. Notice that this is right next to Beta. Israelis should know what happened in Beta. Won't go through it, but it's one of the worst, most ugly, vicious crimes of the occupation. I happened to be able to visit it right at the time when the Israeli army was smashing it to pieces. Went with friends from Al-Haq. We managed to break through military curfew through back roads and got in to see what it actually looked like. Far worse than what was being reported. And there was absolutely no credible pretext for it. You know the story. So that's Beta. This is Eviatar on the borders of Beta. If you want to talk to open the discussion with people who regard them as terrorists, ask them to look at that history. We can take case after case. I walk through the streets of Hebron, for example, and watch Israeli thugs from Kiryat Arba beating up Palestinians, overthrowing vegetable carts, throwing garbage at Palestinians' homes, attacking children on their way to school, all under the protection of the IDF. And then, of course, you get the terrorists who throw some stones at the soldiers. Well, okay, that's the natural structure of occupation, repression, and resistance. So you're living in the midst of it. And you can understand and sympathize with the people who don't like the fact that their children are on the front line having stones thrown at them by Palestinians. Sometimes Israelis get killed, not a fraction of Palestinians, of course. And you can perfectly well understand it. But you have to extricate yourself from it slowly, simply by going through the very well documented, unquestioned historical facts. You can read about them every day. Read Gidon Levy's regular articles in Haaretz, for example, every day. Another atrocity, another crime. That's quite apart from Gaza, which is beyond horrendous. I've visited Gaza. It's astonishing that people can even survive the brutal and vicious Israeli attacks. 1 million children with no water to drink. It's all poison. Israel destroys the energy system, sewage system, nothing, the environment. People you can't even call it a prison. Prisons are better taken care of. Well, that's Gaza. So yes, you get young people coming to the fence and throwing stones at Israeli soldiers, terrorists. Okay. Well, just try to get people to look at the facts that are in front of their eyes. It's hard. I mean, I've had the same problem for 80 years with my own family as well.
Okay, thank you.
But when feelings blind people to the facts, is there a way, from your experience, to bridge that gap somehow? Because we're dealing with most of the Israeli population who won't even look at what you're saying.
Yeah. Exactly the same everywhere else. I mean, I happen to live in the United States. It happens to be right now the 20th anniversary of the US invasion of Iraq, the worst crime of the century by far. No, you can't find one sentence, literally, anywhere near the mainstream saying that this was a crime. Every commentary, right to left, so-called left, anywhere in the mainstream, says this was a noble effort to rescue the Iraqi people from a terrible dictator, which unfortunately turned into a mistake. Small footnote. The US supported the Iraqi dictator passionately all through his worst crimes. Tried to pretend that Iran was responsible for the Halabja massacre, and so on. The United States commemorated the 20th anniversary by commissioning anew the latest assault vessel produced by the US Navy. It named it the USS Fallujah. That would be like the Israeli Navy commissioning the Sabra Shatila, It's one of the worst atrocities of the war. So now it's commemorated by a new assault vessel. No comment on this in the U.S. media. Plenty of comment in the foreign media. Not Europe, but read Al Jazeera, read the Iraqi commentaries. They're infuriated, of course. Doesn't reach Americans. Okay, you have another variant of the same thing. I could give you case after case.
Okay, so this leads us to our next question. The historic Jewish kingdom of Israel and Judea has already been disintegrated. Today, the political atmosphere surrounding the judicial revolution raises a difficult debate, and the split has emerged within Jewish society. Society has raised a heavy concern about a far
Fact.
wait, sorry,
With iPhone.
Eternal war.
eternal war, and for now,
Internal. Um, and for now, the constitutional revolution, so called, has been postponed until summer. What do you think of the recent changes that Israel is going through, and where do you think we are headed?
The best description of it I saw was by Amira Haas. She pointed out that for years, many years, Israel has portrayed itself as a state and an army with a settlement enterprise, which is maybe questionable. She said the fact is that Israel is a settlement enterprise with a state and an army. And now that reality is coming back to the nice Israeli people who live a pleasant life in Tel Aviv and regard themselves as part of the Western liberated world, to support gay pride and so on and so forth. Now the reality is coming back to them. The settler enterprise, which has a state and an army, is not only directed against the Palestinians, but is beginning to be directed right at the heart of Israeli society that regarded itself as liberated, westernized, and so on. Now it's beginning to see the reality. Well, that's a fact. It is a settlement enterprise with a state. And what's happening now in Israel is not unexpected. It was predicted. At the beginning of the occupation, back in 1970, uh, very highly respected Israeli figures, I'm sure you know this, like Yeshayahu Leibovitz, who had no interest in the Palestinians, didn't care about them one way or another. But he said the occupation is going to destroy Israel. It's going to turn Israelis, in his phrase, into Judeo-Nazis. And it's his term. I would never use such a phrase, but he could get away with it. And his point was, when you have your jackboot on somebody's neck, it's not good for your personality. You begin to internalize the values of those who have the jackboot and who beat the victims. Then you find ways of justifying it, becomes part of your personality. You end up with what you're seeing now with the Hilltop Youth and the rest. Okay, or the thugs in Hebron and so on. Well, that's what you're going to see. And I think Israel is now beginning to have to face that fact. The demonstrations of, it's not that the Supreme Court has been such a marvelous institution, it has an outrageous record. Within Israel itself, it does reasonably well support the rights of Jewish uh, majority in Israel, and not of Palestinians. Take, for example, the case of, say, Katzir. It took years before the Supreme Court ever even recognized, I think it was in 2000, that Palestinians have a right to live in a village in Israel. And then various devices were worked out to make sure that it never worked. I think it took the couple who tried to who won the ruling about 6 years before they could even move in with one or another device. Well, for the Palestinians, of course, there's no rights at all. The Israeli Supreme Court is the only judicial body in the world, only one, that refuses to describe the occupied territories as occupied, says they're administered. It's alone in that. Even the U.S. government won't agree. No international institution agrees, not the International Court of Justice, not anyone, but that's the Israeli Supreme Court. They authorize one after another illegal takeover of Palestinian land. Usually, sometimes there's some delay, something for a couple of months that's considered a great step forward, but then they authorize it. Its record in the occupied territories is horrible. It's not just that. I don't know how many of you have read the book by Moshe Negbi called Kistom Hayinu. It's a book that you should read. It's a book about the Israeli justice system. He's the lead I think he's passed away now, but he was the leading Israeli legal commentator in Israeli press. So Kistom Hayinu, and he gives reasons for it, not just massive corruption and courts overlooking it, but also the treatment of Israeli Palestinians is not his main topic, but he brings it up. So the courts are not that beautiful institution that somehow is saving us. As of course you know, a lot of reservists are refusing to support the attack on the judicial system, and refusing to go for training and so on. It's a pretty severe blow to the Israeli elite forces like the Air Force. Serious. Military correspondents like Amos Harel or others are very concerned about it. Why are they refusing? Well, partly it's just their agreement with the elite Israeli opinion, but they have a stake in it. They are protected from investigation by international authorities as long as Israel can pretend to have a judicial system. When that pretense evaporates, then an Israeli pilot bombs a house in Gaza, killing 25 people, can be investigated by international authorities. The protection is lifted. You're not free to just murder and destroy but abandon. Well, that's pretty serious if you're a reserve officer in the Air Force. Okay? All of that is beginning to decline. Furthermore, Israel's international reputation, which is now pretty low, is sinking even further. And that's going to, even in the United States. I don't know if you've looked at polls in the United States, but Israel should pay close attention to them. The support for Israel in the U.S. used to be based on the same kind of people who are demonstrating in the streets of Tel Aviv today. Liberal Democrats, more or less concerned with human rights and so on. That was the base for support for Israel. It's gone. Now more of that category, more Democrats, for example, support Palestinians than support Israelis. Huge change, particularly among young people, including young Jews, incidentally. I mean, I've been involved in this intimately for years, and I could see it for years when I was giving talks on Israel, Palestine, even at American universities, even my own university. I had to have police protection because of the threat of Jewish terrorists. Police had to accompany back to my car. City police would come to make sure that there wasn't violence. Meetings were broken up, even meetings with Israeli speakers. I once invited my friend Israel Shachak to give a talk at my own university. Police protection, meeting broken up. A couple of friends of mine who had escaped Europe just before the Nazis came in, weeks before, were sitting in the back of the room. They said they'd seen nothing like this since Hitler Jugend. Well, that's what things were like in the United States for a long time. It's totally changed. Nothing like it anymore. Now you go to a college campus, you have to feel sorry from the young kid from Hillel Foundation who tries to make a statement that's pro-Israel and gets laughed at. This changed with Cast Lead. It was very striking. That was just too much for people to tolerate. And there was a very sharp change. Support for Israel now is in the evangelical community and the far right and ultranationalists. And recall that the evangelicals, who are the strongest supporters for Israel, are the most extreme anti-Semites in human history. Just take a look at their doctrine. Their doctrine is we have to have a war in the Middle East, Armageddon, and Christ returns, and all the Jews go to eternal perdition, except for 160,000 who have found Christ in time. Even Hitler didn't go that far. These are the strongest supporters of Israel in the United States, along with the military security services and the far right. Well, that's a very unstable situation. Already, for the first time, there's legislation being proposed to question U.S. economic and military aid to Israel, which in fact is in violation of U.S. law. U.S. law bars any military or economic aid, military aid to military units that are engaged in systematic human rights violations. It's the definition of the IDF. Neither political party has wanted to open that door. Furthermore, other U.S. laws bar aid to countries that have developed nuclear weapons outside the framework of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, other international agreements. That's why the United States does not formally recognize that Israel has nuclear weapons. Obviously it does, everybody knows it, but they don't recognize it. Because if you do, US law comes into play. Well, sooner or later, there's going to be pressure to say, okay, let's apply US law. Why should we be giving massive aid to a terrorist violent state that's violating US law? It's going to come along. It's coming along. Well, I think Israel's in a very tenuous position. It's because we should be thinking through this. Back in the 1970s, Israel had a choice. It had a choice between security or expansion. It was very clear. This is Ma'arach. It's not the Pri Likud, Golda Meir and the rest, Yitzhak Rabin. They had a choice. And it was very clear. The Arab states were calling for a peaceful settlement. PLO was more or less supporting it. The United Nations Security Council debated a resolution, 1976, calling for a two-state settlement on the international border, maybe some modifications, which would, I'm practically quoting now, could guarantee the right of each state to exist in peace and security within secure and recognized borders, strongly supported by Egypt, Syria, Jordan, almost the entire world. Israel was so infuriated, refused to attend the session. Yitzhak Rabin was the UN ambassador, bitterly condemned the UN for even thinking about it. The United States vetoed it. It's a long record since then. But in fact, the Main issue then, as you recall, was settlement in the Sinai, the Galilee Protocols. The Mayor government wanted to have extensive settlement in the Egyptian Sinai. The Israel made a choice then. It could have had security, peace, but chose expansion. Well, there's a consequence to that. Choose expansion over security. You have to rely on someone to provide the security. That's the United States. Israel made a fateful bargain. We're going to defend, we're going to let our survival depend on support from the United States against the world. What happens when that support declines? Israel is now facing the consequences of that decision. It's a serious issue. And the family members and others who you're talking to should be thinking about that. These should be topics right at the heart of Israeli discussion now. That Security Council resolution was not the only one. There were others. Same story. The U.S. vetoed it. You look at the General Assembly resolutions from 70s right to almost the present. There are votes like 150 to 3. The 3 are United States, Israel, and some U.S. dependency, maybe some Pacific island. That's what Israel has bet on. That's the gamble that's taken. And now it's coming to a head. Well, Leibovitz's warning was accurate. That's the dynamics that develops. And you can see it all around you. I mean, you can see it in an extreme form in groups like, the Hava, La Familia, and so on. But you see it all through the society.
Do you think it's a real risk that we will split regarding everything connected to the Palestinians, but right now it's like an inside Israeli discussion about splitting more to a more right-wing country and to more liberal country. Do you think this could really happen, in your view?
You know much more about this than I do. You're right in the middle of it. I just read about it. But you can read, for example, the poll this morning, or it says a poll this morning on the popularity of the parties. So right now, Gallant is the hero because Netanyahu fired him. Take a look at his record. He was one of the main killers in Gaza. Horrible record. He's the hero. So what's the split? It's there. If you listen to people like Smotrich and Ben Gvir and the religious rabbis, they say, okay, let's split. They don't care. At least they say they don't care. I don't know what they're thinking. They say, okay, if we have to separate out and get rid of these reform, these semi-Jews who are not true, deeply committed Haredim, let's get rid of them. They're just a poison. And we'll have our religious nationalist state. We've got God on our side, so what do we care? Maybe the world's against us, but us and God will win. Okay. I'm sure that's a sentiment, strong sentiment in Israel. And as you know very well, better than I do, there's a class element behind it. The Mizrahim have been treated in a very ugly fashion. I saw it myself when I was living there 75 years ago, many times on visits, but you know better than I. And they bitterly resent the Ashkenazi elite. So there's class element underlying it too. Complicated issue. But could Israel split up? Frankly, I doubt it. I think the society is probably strong enough to overcome it, but it's a threat. I'm living in the United States. There could be a split here too. There's strong secessionist movement in the United States. It's not a joke. The Republican-run far-right states say, why should we be burdened by the liberal coastal elites? Well, throughout the world, not just Israel, things pretty much like this are happening. Each region has its own reasons, but the overall one constant element throughout most of it affects Israel too, is the neoliberal policies of the past 40 years, which have shattered societies. They've greatly increased inequality, left a huge mass of people who live precarious existences, even in the rich countries, more so in the United States than Europe, because the United States doesn't have a support system of the kind that Europe has. But great mass of people who are angry, resentful, hate institutions, don't trust them, with good reasons. And they're very fertile terrain for demagogues of the Trump variety. And these things are happening worldwide. A lot of different causes, but one constant cause is the neoliberal attack on society in the past 45 years, which is no joke. The United States very carefully studied. So just to give you an example, the last 45 years, transfer of wealth from the working class and the middle class, lower 90% of the population, transfer of wealth to them, from them to the top 1%, is $50 trillion since Reagan. That's a lot of money. That's class war with a vengeance. And it's had a very substantial effect on the society. Social dysfunction, breakdown of the social order, particularly striking in countries like the United States with a very powerful business class, hence very little in the way of social protection. Even trivial things like maternal leave, let's say. The United States is the only country that doesn't have it. Not even, take, say, somebody like Bernie Sanders is considered a radical in the United States. One of the editors of the London Financial Times, the world's leading business journal, pointed out that if Sanders was in Germany, he could be running on the conservative Christian Democrat program, which is correct. He's calling for universal health care, free higher education, things considered so radical in the United States, you can barely talk about them, which is interesting because the population strongly supports them, but not the political class, not the business classes who have overwhelming dominance. It's not just the United States. You can see it in Europe as well. Just take a look at this morning's newspapers again. Norway, considered a leading social democratic country. There's a flight of billionaires leaving Norway. Why? Because they slightly raised the wealth tax. Okay, we're living in constant class war. You can pretend otherwise if you like, but the rulers of the world, they don't pretend. They know it's class war, they're fighting it. If nobody resists, they win. But part of the failure of resistance is the failure even to recognize it. It's there. And it had an effect in Israel too. Israel, you don't have to go very far back to find the time when Israel was a social democratic country with decent provisions for people. That's pretty much gone. You don't have to go through the details.
There's an interesting paradox there where, as you said, the neoliberal policies and the class wars is what deteriorated the situation. And now we have the right wing, which is supposedly affiliated with with right-wing economics, neoliberal and free market and whatnot, trying to over. It's making it worse. It's like a kind of avalanche, snowball.
First of all, you're perfectly correct in saying that right-wing economics talks about free markets, talks about, they don't believe a word of it. The United States, for example, is an exemplar. It's a bailout economy. When Reagan opened the floodgates, do whatever you like, uh, the financial institutions grew enormously. They now pretty much dominate the economy. That's where you make money, by uh, trickery in financial markets, not by developing things. There were never any bank failures in the 50s and the 60s because banks were regulated, ended. Now, starting with the Reagan administration, you have regular financial crashes, one after another. We're in the middle of one right now. What happens? The taxpayer steps in and bails out the perpetrators. That's the free market. Free market is make as much money as you can, cheating, lying, whatever you do. When you crash the economy, we'll come in and bail you out. That's the free market. You're seeing it right in front of your eyes, right this minute, with the Silicon Valley crashes. Huge subsidies to those who caused it. In fact, if you look at the details, it's pretty striking. There is insurance for deposits in banks up to $250,000. But when the rich guys lost their deposits, the Federal Reserve changed that. Now you bail out everybody, even if you lost $1 billion. Taxpayer has to bail you out. That's the free market. You look at the international trade agreements, so-called. They're called free trade agreements. They're an absolute joke. They're investor rights agreements, huge protection for private capital, a patent regime of the kind that never existed in history. If it existed, the United States would be exporting agricultural products and fur today. The only reason it developed is because it could take technology from more advanced societies like England, which had enriched itself by robbing India. Uh, it's the whole history of capitalism. There's no free markets. That's propaganda from the powerful. So forget the term. Uh, so we have the bailout, and the same with the fossil fuel industries. For a fraction of the subsidies given to fossil fuel industries, you could lead to a renewable economy. But in fact, take a look at what's happening. This is the biggest issue for Israel, for example. I don't know if you've been following it, but Israeli scientists, geoscientists, for years have been warning Israel, the Israeli government, that there's a very serious threat coming. The Eastern Mediterranean is heating up about twice as fast as the world average. And they're predicting that by the end of the century, the sea level in the Mediterranean will have risen 2 to 2.5 meters. Take a look at Israel. What's going to happen to Israel? 2 to 2.5 meters. Uh, the Mediterranean in the summer will reach the temperature of a jacuzzi. What's going to happen? Well, how's Israel reacting? By making a deal with Lebanon to increase the danger by producing more gas and oil in the maritime region. Well, it's right where you live, you know. What's going to happen to Tel Aviv when sea level rises 2 meters? Don't have that time. And it's the same everywhere. The United States just passed environmental legislation, which is greatly praised. It's not nothing, but you take a look at how it works. The way it works is by trying to bribe the fossil fuel companies to be nice guys. You want to deal with too much fossil fuel production, bribe the guys who are producing the fossil fuels. You have to do that in a capitalist society. It's understood. During the Second World War, when the US was mobilizing for war, this are days I remember very well, total mobilization. The head of the mobilization, Henry Stimson, Secretary of War, uh, wrote that, firstly quoting him, he said, in a capitalist society, if you want anything to happen, you have to ensure that the business classes profit from it. You want to mobilize for war? You guys cut back your wages, plant victory gardens, don't drive. But the rich guys, the business classes, they have to be paid off. And then maybe they'll allow us to mobilize for war. Well, those are the world, that's the world we live in. You can pretend otherwise if you like, but that's what it is. So right now, you want to deal with the environmental catastrophe, which was what it is, try to bribe the criminals to be nicer. No? Okay. Um, these are just the facts of life. Pretend they don't exist if you want, but not going to help yourself. Mhm.
So this leads us to our
Yeah,
next question.
very related. If so, as you say, the world, this is how it works. There are some who claim that without the change of the economic paradigm, no social, geopolitical stability can be expected. Capitalism basing itself upon competition, scarcity, cyclical consumption, advertising, etc., is the root of the very instability and aggression between nations and individuals. And Zionism is not exempt from that. The resource race, geostrategical conquest. Do you think What do you think must change foremost in order to bring about true progress? Are we to expect consciousness, economics, and policy to evolve simultaneously?
Well, any kind of constructive action has to begin with recognition of reality. Don't recognize reality, can't do anything. You're trapped by illusions, rhetoric, free market, terrorists, and so on and so forth. So the first thing to do is try to lift the veil, face the reality. Reality is complex. It's not one factor. So Israel faces problems different from the problems of Germany, let's say, or Belgium, or Iraq, and so on. But there are some uniformities. We do live in a fundamentally capitalist world. In fact, have for as far back as you can remember. There are countries that were called socialist, but they weren't remotely socialist. Working people had more rights in the United States than they had in Soviet Russia. That was just more rhetoric and delusion. But it's basically state capitalist economies. Well, state capitalist economies can vary. They can be more savage or less savage. Take the United States again. During the New Deal period, which lasted through the 1960s, as I said, there were no bank failures. Now, there was a big growth period, relatively egalitarian, plenty wrong with it, but it wasn't the massive highway robbery of the working people in the middle class that we've seen in the last 40 years. In fact, go back to the 1970s, the US was pretty much like other developed societies by most measures. Now it's off the spectrum uh, because you moved from regulated capitalism to savage capitalism. Well, capitalism itself is a death warrant. You can't have a society based on profit and accumulation and expect it to survive. So it has to be controlled somehow or it'll just self destruct. Well, various means. Open it up, moves to self-destruction. That's what we've been in for 40 years. Go back to something like the capitalism of Dwight Eisenhower, not particularly utopian goal, then you could have some hope of extricating yourself from the immediate problems. You still have the deeper problem of a society based on a master-servant relation, exploitation, profit, accumulation, what Adam Smith 250 years ago called the vile maxim of the masters of mankind. All for ourselves, nothing for anyone else. You recognize that's the driving force of capitalism. Didn't approve of it, of course. Well, it is. If you can constrain it, have some way of surviving. If you can overcome it, you can move to a much more decent world. Those are long struggles. It has to go in steps. First step, face reality. That's not easy. That was your first question. How can you get people to face the reality that is right in front of their eyes, not remote? That's hard enough. Then look at things that aren't right in front of your eyes. There's a little bit in the background. Harder. Do that. Can be done. Go back to the history of Israel. I mean, Israel was once a cooperative, worker-based society. Uh, uh, Bus cooperatives, health cooperatives, egalitarian communities, a sense of participation in community, totally different attitudes. Not the whole of the society, of course, but a substantial part of it and a leading part of it, a part that was respected and was progressive. It was true in the not very far past. I think that's one of the reasons why you have this strange phenomenon in Israel that shows up in polls, which is quite unusual, that young people are more reactionary than the older generation. Almost always it's the other way around. Well, the older generation has some memory of something that used to exist, has been torn apart. Netanyahu, neoliberal assault, tear it apart. Now we move from social democratic controlled capitalism to savage capitalism. That's what's been happening in Israel. Changes attitudes, perceptions, points of view, spreads pretty widely. Now, these are things that don't have a single cause. It interacts with lots of things happening internal to society, which are special to it, like the occupation in Israel. But it's never been an easy struggle. But there's been plenty of progress over the years. I mean, things that were considered normal and acceptable 40 or 50 years ago are unspeakable today. Rights of women, for example, uh, rights of minorities. Take the United States, which is in many ways in the forefront of liberal democracies, or was. 50 years ago, the United States had anti-miscegenation laws that were so extreme that Nazis refused to accept them. It had federally funded housing, but it was segregated by law, no blacks. That's 50 years ago. Women literally were considered property under the law. It's British common law. Women are property of the father, handed over to the husband. It wasn't until 1975, under pressure from young activists, that the Supreme Court finally decided that women are peers. They have a right to serve in federal juries. It's not that long ago. There have been advances. A lot of rotten things now, but there are advances. And history's not over. There can be more and more deeper and fundamental ones.
So, are you hopeful? I hope it's not a too wide of a question, but it's our final one.
You have basically two choices. You can say, there's no hope, I give up. You can help ensure that the worst will happen, or you can grasp the opportunities that exist, and they do exist. Maybe you'll make it a better world. Not a very hard choice.
It's very hard for me as a young person to really feel this hope and optimism that you're talking about because I kind of look around and it's getting harder every day in my eyes.
It's getting harder in some ways, easier in others. Uh, take a town like uh, Nazareth, elite, the suburbs. They were pure Jewish. It was set up as a pure Jewish community, no Arabs allowed. Well, now it's a mixed community. And that's a step forward. It's happened in other places, uh, towns and villages that were in Israel that were established as Arab Rhine, no Palestinians, have now begun to change. You go to the Hebrew University, you can take a math class with a Palestinian professor. Okay? It wasn't that way in the past. There are moves, steps forward, steps backward. It's the way the world progresses, or sometimes regresses. So, what can you do? Try to move it forward. Going to be constant battles, uh, class war, religious war, nationalist war, so on. Try to take steps towards improving understanding, awareness, bringing more people into what ought to be a common struggle. And remember, we're living at a unique moment of history, of human history. There's never been anything like it before. Your generation, no avoiding it, your generation is going to decide whether human society continues. That's literally the case. You've read the latest IPC report, I'm sure, or looked at it. The situation is dire. We have a couple of decades in which it's possible, feasible, to uh, prevent the race over the precipice. You lose that possibility, we get into irreversible tipping points. I mentioned what Israel is going to look like. Uh, Much of the region is going to be uninhabitable. Most of South Asia is going to be uninhabitable. Africa, uh, well, that's what we're racing towards. About a generation, maybe, to overcome it. Now, that's going to have to be overcome by accommodation. Something very significant just happened in the Middle East. China intervened to bring about an accommodation between two bitter enemies, Saudi Arabia and Iran. That's of extreme importance. Israel hates it, the United States hates it, breaks up the hope of creating an alliance of violent reactionary states led by the United States aimed at Iran. This throws a wrench in those policies, might even lead to an end to the Yemen war, proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is horrific. All of that is a step forward. If Iran and Saudi Arabia can be brought to accommodate through Chinese intervention, maybe something else can happen. President Macron of France was just in China talking about moves towards some form of accommodation between China and the European Union, extricating Europe from US domination. That's an old hope. Gorbachev, at the end, the Soviet Union collapsed. Mikhail Gorbachev proposed a European common home from Lisbon to Vladivostok with no military alliances. Makes very good sense. Uh, Europe and Russia are perfect match of trading partners. Russia has not much of an economy, but has enormous resources. Europe has industrial capacity, technology, no resources. China market is sitting there, developing, expanding over much of the world. Gotta have accommodation. US and China too. Unless there's accommodation among the great powers, we'll all sink together. Well, there are steps towards it. You just saw a major step right nearby where you are. Couldn't have predicted that 10 years ago. Iran and Saudi Arabia were at each other's throats. Now, exchanged foreign ministers, beginning to work together. Saudi Arabia actually joined the Shanghai Cooperation Council, China-based development program, extending all over Africa, even Latin America.